Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Irish World Towns Network for giving me the privilege of speaking today. And I also want to thank the two guys before for two great and diverse presentations. A bit about myself. My name's Andrew Abraham, and I'm from Queen's University in Belfast. And this is a piece of research that I began conducting last year for my dissertation. I'm currently a final year master's student, and this is ongoing. What this looks at is the contested spaces in Belfast, and in specific the planned spaces and the peace walls. So, the media like to sensationalise division in Belfast and the politics, and there's no doubt that it is a very sensitive topic. But for someone like myself, it was refreshing. I have very little living memory of the Troubles, which essentially categorised the divide, and it's nice to look at things with a clean slate. The divide manifests itself in a number of areas around the city, and in the past it's even gone into the city centre. You can see the ring of steel, the infamous ring of steel, which blocked the city centre off from the rest of the city in the past, but in the image on the right, you can see that it's no longer the case, and I think Belfast is a place that's going forward. So in terms of my aims and objectives, what I wanted to look at was investigating a means of diversifying memories that have been impacted by the past events of Northern Ireland, and what our current approaches in planning have been for these areas, and sort of what we are doing about that as designers, as planners, and also exploring the actual divides themselves and how they're manifested, because I think that the planners and designers in these areas have a lot to account for. I don't know whether many would be aware, but there are a number of physical manifestations of divide in the city, in particular the West, and this is the area that I have decided to conduct my research in, because it's made up of the most diverse sort of ethnic groups. You can see here, this is a peace wall, so-called, ironically, that divides two ethnic communities in the west of the city. And really, this paper looked at sort of analysing their purpose in society. And architecture itself has quite a role when it comes to control. I used the Pyramid of Giza as an example, in that it was originally designed as a tomb, but the dual purpose being that it would sort of display the power of the Egyptian pharaohs and restore order to the populace, and I think that architecture does that. As well as that, I've also included an image of One World Trade Center, which is currently the tallest building in Manhattan and serves as a sort of memorial to the attacks of 9/11. And I think that that's interesting because that is something that's within my living memory, and also I've included a newspaper article because the media have an awful lot to do with informing how societies remember things and that idea of collective memory. And almost combining the two, here you have a mural in West Belfast that sort of conveys memory through both stories and in a physical means. In terms of the planners and design for these spaces, I've shown an example here of the city centre and the west of the city. This is the centre of the city and this is the west, and it's the same area, but the difference being that red line that you can see down the middle it's what's called the West Link, which is a motorway that was planned in the 70s and has been built and has essentially cut off the west of the city from the city centre. And you can see the effect that that's had on the urban grain and the fabric of the city on either side. So I really wanted to look at this in terms of what are the design solutions and what can we learn from these. So my methods and how I decided to conduct this was I thought that the best way to do this was to actually speak to the locals from the communities themselves and sort of get their insight into their memories and sort of how their attitudes are informed by the built environment. I also interviewed some planners, quite high profile ones, in particular Ken Sterrett, who is sort of a government advisor in terms of planning in Northern Ireland. And I also looked at, I interviewed an architect from the public sector who had worked on these peace walls. I also started to conduct some research using surveying and mapping. And I tried to get a map of the peace walls to start the research, and was interested to find that no such map exists. And it's amazing because there are over 80 peace walls in the city of Belfast, and none of them are on a map, yet they have a massive influence on the societies that they're in. You can see here the impact that it has on the residents. That's just a letter to confirm that no such map exists. So, in terms of surveying, you can see that the peace walls themselves are, in terms of human scale, absolutely colossal. The map, this drawing is of a peace wall in Cooper Way to scale, and shows the layering of concrete, brick, and steel, corrugated steel. And really the peace walls were first developed as sort of concertina wire and knife rests that were sort of imposed by the British Army to restore order and to keep communities at bay. And all of a sudden they went from this temporary measure to physical and very permanent. And there are more today in the city than there ever have been. And it's amazing to think of that, given that Belfast has come so far in the last 2 decades. In terms of looking at the urban fabric again, this is a plan of where that wall sits, and it's indicated by the red line. And up here you have one community, and here you have another. And you can see the difference in terms of how the urban fabric again has been affected and impacted by this wall and this imposition. But another thing that we've got to look at is the planning strategies that have been adopted. And during the 60s and 70s, a lot of planners looked at the sort of Oscar Newman approach of defensible space, whereby if people had their own territory, then they would look after it and it would restore order. So what ended up occurring was that there were a number of cul-de-sacs that developed, and that was detrimental in a way, in that you had 2 communities on either side of a physical divide, and due to the planning measures they became further divided because each person only looked after their own area. And you can see the formation of the cul-de-sacs around here. So this is sort of a map that I had sort of I was putting together of the west of the city just by walking and driving around. There are a number across the rest of the city. I've just focused on the west because it's sort of the most diverse. Many would argue it's the most contested, but I think contested isn't a great phrase to use, because I think we've been moving on from that, and quite often the media portray things in a negative light, and I think phrases like contested space only enforce that. Of course, Belfast isn't the only place that has been divided in terms of by architecture. We look at Berlin. It's again, the Berlin Wall is something that isn't in my living memory, but I'm certainly aware of it. And after visiting the city, I know that there is a strong sense of attachment to the wall that was once there. Although it's slightly different, and I wouldn't really compare it to Belfast in that it was one nation that was divided by 2 political regimes. It's still interesting to note the memory that's associated with that wall. And again, it's Jerusalem is another case, and it's interesting to note that the 2 communities in Northern Ireland have sort of sided with kind of the Israeli cause and the Palestinian cause, in a way of sort of relating their struggle with another. Here you can see a mural and some flags in different areas that sympathise with that. Again, though, as I mentioned earlier about the idea of defensible space. It is about territory, and what you have is in areas where there is no sort of claim over territory, you have hotbeds of violence and sort of social disorder. And I think it's interesting to look at the Titanic Quarter because that's currently what's being marketed by Belfast as sort of the Phoenix of Belfast. And the council used the term re-imaging, which I think is almost Orwellian in that it's, you know, let's just brush everything onto the carpet and start again. But we need to respect the heritage, and we need to find ways to do that. So one of the ways in which the planners and the government have aimed at dealing with this in the past is in sort of areas where two sort of groups meet and there's a divide, they've inserted industrial estates, and it's what we call the industrial buffer. And basically what happened was they put largely neutral spaces in between to sort of dilute the divide. But what ended up happening was that you were getting entrances on either side, and it was really just another manifestation of the divide. Due to the economy as well, the industrial estates didn't hold out well, and what you ended up having were vacant sites. And again, with that, sites that don't have any ownership tend to fall victim to sort of violence and social disorder. And it's interesting to note that this was one of the vacant industrial sites, and one of the groups had actually sort of marked their territory, so to speak, by painting it in their colours and sort of laying territorial claim to it. And again, it is about territory and it's also about people. And it's amazing that on one side of the divide you have housing that there's a real need for housing, and as a result the houses are right up against the peace wall, and on the other side there's no need for it, and what you're left with are barren areas of space. But it's not a case of just gifting that space to the other side, because there is a divide there, and whilst it is physical, there is an attachment to it as well, that if the wall was to be removed, the divide would still certainly exist. And I think this is interesting because one of the architects I interviewed said that they made no effort to talk to people. And I mean, these are people who live there, and it's just crazy, and it's bureaucratic, and it's policy driven. So I started to look at, whilst that's all quite negative, I started to look at what actually does work. And there's this idea of unsolicited design, and I think it's very interesting. This particular shipping container, I view it as a really significant point, albeit it's small and it's small scale. But this is a heavily contested space in North Belfast, and there's a peace line there at Alexandra Park. And basically this was a bonfire site, and a gentleman called William bought the bonfire site and cleaned it up and put a shipping container there, which is used as a corner shop. And it's amazing that he has essentially taken something that is one-sided in a bonfire and got rid of it and put something there that serves both communities. And people from all over visit this corner shop, and I think it's testament to design in these areas and what can be done, and it's very simple. I think it's amazing as well though, because when that was put there, he got letters from the planning authority saying that it didn't fit in with the character of the area, and that they tried to get it removed, I think on 6 occasions. And it's absurd to think that. I mean, they say that it doesn't fit in with the character of the area, but one would argue what actually is the character of the area. And yeah, I think unsolicited, that idea of small scale is a way forward. I think the overall goal of removing the walls is far-fetched. It's not a case of re-imaging and just getting rid of the walls and ignoring the people. But things like this are really inspirational for designers and young designers like myself and like the guys that were here today. The other way to look at it is the injection of good design, and here are 2 landmark projects in Belfast that have emerged in the last sort of 4 or 5 years: the Mac by Hall McKnight and the Lyric Theatre, and they've really boosted the city, and they bring people to it, and they really, the areas that they're in have really benefited from this good design and thought out design, and there are people from all over that come here. So do we look at these contested spaces and we create new buildings here that will bring people to it? Do we bring new people to the areas? That's another option. I think that due to the fact that the city's been cut off from the rest might make that difficult, but I think that the unsolicited design idea is certainly worthwhile. And here's the peace walls being used as canvases, which is really inspirational. Pretty much that's me. I just want to talk briefly about this idea that I've taken this idea of unsolicited design forward and come up with sort of contextual modular designs that can be inserted into these areas to boost them, and that it ranges from sort of bonfire sites inspired by that small cafe / corner shop to the city centre. And the thing I just want to finish on is that it is all good, and I think that there's a lot to be. I think that from interviewing the people in those areas, they are very caring and they care about their community, and there certainly is a community spirit on both sides. But I think that design and infrastructure and decisions and mistakes that have been carried out in the past have prevented these people from going forward. So really, I think that if anyone here takes anything from this, it's to be very wary of the context that you're designing in, and to consider the people, because quite often they've been neglected in the past. Thanks very much.